honestly what I think may be the most odd and strange and just crazy passage in all of the book of Revelation, and that is in Revelation chapter 9. We're in verses 1 through 12. Now, we're not going to do a review tonight, but I do want to just kind of remind you, because it's been a couple weeks, we are in the blowing of the seven trumpets, and as these seven trumpets have been blown, we have seen the first four, and all of the first four deal with natural calamity. We've seen disaster on the land with the first trumpet. We've seen disaster on the sea with the second trumpet, disaster on the fresh water with the third trumpet, and disaster in the sky with the fourth trumpet. The disaster in the sky being that the moon, the stars, the sun, all of it gets darkened. And then verse 13 gives us a transitional passage between the first four and the next two. Now, the way we have seen these signs or these symbols unfold with the seals and now with the trumpets is you have the first four kind of being grouped together, and then you have the next two being grouped together, and then you have an interlude between number 6 and number 7. And so here we have the grouping of the first four, all dealing with natural calamity. Then you have verse 13, which simply says, "Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow." So you have this image of an eagle. Now, for us as Americans, when we have the image of the eagle, we think of pride and strength and honor. I mean, the image of the eagle for us is representative of our country, and so it is a positive image. That is not the case in this society. Matter of fact, the word that's translated eagle here can also mean vulture. Now, if I tell you that then the vulture is crying, "Woe, woe, woe," that gives us a completely different image of what's going on than an eagle. I mean, a vulture is a bird of prey. We see vultures, on the side of the road eating the roadkill. We think of vultures as kind of being ominous and dangerous and nothing. They're a sign of death. They're a sign of destruction. And so when you hear this eagle crying out with a loud voice, I don't want you to think the pride of America. I want you to think the woe of a bird that devours its prey. As a matter of fact, eagles, vultures, they were both considered unclean because they would eat dead animals. And so this eagle or vulture, if it helps your imagery, cries out with a loud voice and cries out, "Woe, woe, woe." I believe, if my recollection is correct, there are only two words that are repeated in the Bible consecutively 3 times. The words holy, holy, holy to describe God as perfectly holy, and the words woe, woe, woe to describe God's perfect destruction, God's perfect judgment on the earth. And so here is the woe, 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 and we're going to see that this woe, woe, woe is going to coincide with John telling us this is the first woe. This is the second woe. Jump down real quick to verse 12 of chapter 9. And he says, "The first woe has passed. Behold, 2 woes are still to come." And then jump down to chapter 11. Go to verse 14. And you'll see there it says this, "The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come." And so this eagle, this vulture, crying out, "Woe, woe, woe," is a symbol to the listeners, to the readers, to say, hey, God's judgment is not finished yet. His perfect judgment has come in the form of natural calamity, the land, the sea, the fresh waters, the sky. That's the first, the second, third, and fourth trumpet. But now we see it continue with the blowing of the 5th and the 6th trumpet. And so tonight, we're going to start with this, or we're going to just focus on the fifth trumpet. It's interesting that in just a handful of verses, he describes all four trumpets, that are natural calamities. Doesn't really go into the detail that we find in the fifth trumpet, but when the fifth trumpet is blown, man, it is all kinds of crazy. So maybe that's just me reading it, but I want you, as I read chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, I want you to read not with your intellect, but I want you to read with your imagination. I don't know how you read, but the way I typically read is, particularly if I'm reading some kind of book that's a fiction book that's telling me a story, I'll kind of imagine what the characters look like. In my head, I'll imagine as the author gives us descriptions of maybe how the color hair, or the author gives us description of stature. Maybe if the author is giving descriptions of background, I'll just kind of imagine and picture that in my brain and just kind of think through what the scenery would look like. If you do that here, I promise you're going to get a little bit confused, because I don't know that our brains can put together the images that John is describing here. So let's start in chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, and we'll read through verse 12. It says, "And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth. And he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. And he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. And they were told not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green plant, or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. In the appearance, the locusts were like horses, prepared for battle. And on their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, their teeth like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots, with horses rushing into battle. They have tails and stings like scorpions, and their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon. The first woe has passed. Behold, 2 woes are still to come." So here we have this imagery. And I don't know if you tried, but I mean, we're going from a fallen star to a bottomless pit to smoke rising up, and then the smoke turns into locusts, and then the locusts turn to scorpions, and the scorpions turn to horses, and then the horses have crowns, which some have said maybe that's blonde hair. They've got faces like humans. They've got hair like belonging to a woman. All of this imagery is just kind of thrown together, and my mind just can't fathom. I mean, some people are great at artistry, and they can, draw things. And how do you draw this? smoke and locusts and scorpions and like all of the imagery that John is using. And that's why I tell you that when you read the book of Revelation, don't read it with your intellect. Don't read it with your mind trying to figure out what every single detail means. Instead, read it with your imagination. So don't focus on I guess the way I would describe it is, if you're watching a play, don't just focus on the dialogue. Focus on the actions of the person that's doing the acting. Focus on the behaviors and how all of that plays a part in the whole story of the play. Here, there is all of this imagery that's taking place. And I mentioned in the first 4 seals, we're dealing with natural calamity. I spent today reading 6 different commentaries, and I've consulted more than that, but just this afternoon I went to 6 different commentaries that I have found to be good sources for good information on the book of Revelation, and all 6 of them had different opinions about the 5th trumpet. Every single one of them, they had some areas of agreement, but a lot of them had differences of opinion on the overall imagery of what's being portrayed here. So I'm going to do my best. I am no scholar for sure, but I'm going to do my best to try to help paint some of that imagery and give you an idea of what I think is happening in this trumpet. Now, remember, I'm reading this text from the whole book of Revelation, from this idea that John is doing what we call recapitulation. So John is not giving us a linear timeline of events that happens this, then this, then this, then this. But rather, John is giving us a picture that is meant to encourage the Christians in the Roman Empire, the Christians who in the chapters 2 and 3 had lost their lives and their livelihood because they refused to worship the emperor. So John is writing, giving them a glimpse of heaven, giving them a glimpse of God's judgment, as these people are wondering, how long, God, are we going to have to deal with this? What about those who are persecuting us? When are they going to get their comeuppance? When are they going to get what they've been dishing out? When is it going to come back to them? That's the question that's in the back of the minds of these Christians in the first century. And John is giving us these images that say to these Christians, don't worry, God is in control. God is taking care of it, and God's judgment will come. And so I think we have seen that in the unveiling of the seals. Remember, every time we opened a seal, the way John was telling it, we got a picture of God's judgment just a little bit. Now, in reality, if a scroll has 7 seals, you don't get to read the scroll until you break all 7 seals, and then you can unroll the scroll. But John wasn't writing to the intellect. John wasn't writing us in a way to say, hey, let's open all 7 seals and then read the scroll. As a matter of fact, the scroll was kind of insignificant. I mean, it was the unveiling of the seals that kind of gave us the context of the scroll as it was unveiled. The same with the trumpets. Each one of these trumpets blowing are declarations and proclamations of God's judgment on the earth. And so you have in verses 1 through, in chapter 8, verses 6 through the end of the chapter, the blowing of these trumpets of natural calamity. And here you have the blowing of the trumpets where you see something that is unnatural. In fact, it defies nature. So let's kind of unfold, and then I'll give you my opinion on it. Let's kind of read some of these images. We'll start in verse 1. It says, and the 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth. Now, let's just pause there for a second. The language that's being used here is, if you're translating this literally from the Greek, you'll notice that fallen is for us a past tense. It's a completed action. So the idea is not that John saw the star fallen, or that John saw the star fall itself, but that the star had already fallen. And then the star was given. This is what I've described to you as the divine passive, where we see God is in control. There are a lot of people who interpret this character right here as Satan himself. And so they'll read the star fallen from heaven, and there's good reason for that. You've got imagery, in Luke chapter 10, Jesus describes Satan as falling like lightning from the sky, like a comet. And so, there is imagery of Satan being a fallen angel, a fallen star. So there's good reason for that. The fact that he's given a key to the bottomless pit. Now, some translations translate this word abyss. And the reason they translated the word abyss is because the Greek word is the word abyss. And so what they just do is just transliterate that directly from the Greek. But the word abyss in the Greek means what we might think of as a bottomless pit, a hole in the ground that has no ending. And so the English Standard Version, I believe, is correct in translating this bottomless pit because it gives us an idea of what's being done here, of what John is seeing. And so this fallen star falls from heaven to earth, is given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, and he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of the great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. So, a couple of things that I'll mention. This imagery, particularly with Mount Vesuvius having happened not that far away from Asia, and Mount Vesuvius happening in 79 AD, the imagery of fire pulling up and smoke billowing up is not something that they would consider unusual. This is imagery that they would think, okay, this is kind of like a volcano. But I think it's different than what was described as we saw in verse 8 of chapter 8. In verse 8, we saw the second angel blew his trumpet. Something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures of the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. I think that's probably much more of this idea of a volcano because you have this idea of a mountain. Here, I think the abyss is John alluding to the dwelling place of the dead, the dwelling place of the demons. And so makes sense to interpret this as Satan. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, I don't think it's Satan in this text, but I'll explain why in a minute. But you can see why there's a lot of people who will say this is Satan, particularly as we get to the very end, and I'll just kind of reveal it. Apollyon, Abaddon, that means destruction or destroyer, which is a name that would certainly describe Satan. And so there's a lot of people who say, well, this is a description of Satan being unleashed on the earth, him unleashing the demons from hell to come and give torture on the earth. But I'm not convinced that's a proper interpretation. If that's your interpretation, I'm not going to say you're wrong. I certainly think that's within the bounds of exegesis here. But I think there's a better understanding that would make more sense to the first century Christians. So he opens the shaft. Smoke begins to rise. It's like a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with smoke from the shaft. Now, I don't want you to think, typically, a lot of people read these events and they read them as if they're cumulative events. I don't think John is giving us a cumulative event that is stacking on top of the previous four trumpets. I think this is a separate trumpet that it's as if John hasn't given us a description of the four trumpets. He's not asking you to remember what's happened in the first four trumpets and to say, wait a second, didn't that already happen? Because yes, as a matter of fact, the sun in the sky was already darkened. We saw that there when the fourth angel blew his trumpet in verse 12. It says, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and the third of the stars, so that a third of the light would be darkened. John is not trying to give us a cumulative effect from trumpet to trumpet. What John is just describing is, here's a trumpet being blown, and here's the destruction that's coming along with that. And so the sun is darkened, the smoke is so dark, and then this is where it really starts to get weird. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions. And so we've got smoke that well, maybe it's not really smoke. Maybe it just looks like smoke because it's that many locusts that are being let go. And so then there's locusts, but these aren't just any kind of locusts. These locusts have the power of scorpions, and we're going to read a little bit later on that they've got tails of scorpions and things like that. But locusts are a plague that it was common in that area. How many of you have had armyworms in your yard? Everybody, this like armyworms right now in the Shoals area, they're everywhere. Everybody in my neighborhood, their grass is all turning brown. My lawn guy tells me you don't have to worry about it. Armyworms, they don't actually destroy it. They just kind of eat the top. It'll look brown, but your grass is not going to die permanently of it. So anyway, locusts. Think of locusts as what we're dealing with armyworms right now. They come in, they devour the grass, they devour the fields, they would devour crops. A typical locust plague lasts 5 months. That's the life cycle of a locust plague. Just like armyworms have life cycles. Again, my yard guy tells me that so far there have been 2 cycles in the shoals or 2 attacks of armyworms. We just finished the second one. He expects another 3rd wave of armyworms coming up a little bit later on. That's just the nature of if you study these things, if you know, if this is your job and what you do, you know these things. 5 months is the length of time in which locusts would come in and you'd have to endure. And so these locusts are coming in, but instead of eating the grass, instead of eating the green plant, instead of eating tree, which, by the way, they were destroyed in the previous trumpets. So again, we're not talking cumulative here. But instead of eating them, the only thing that will appease the appetite of these locusts are people. And so they are coming to attack. It says, they were told not to harm, verse 4, the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And so John is saying that this abyss is open. This bottomless pit is opened up. Star falls from the sky. He's given the key to the abyss. And again, was given implies that God is the one in control. God is the one that gives the key over. That's just kind of the language that John continues to use as was given authority, was given the key. So this abyss opens up. This smoke comes out, darkens the sky, but maybe it's not smoke, maybe it's just locusts. And it's not just any locusts, maybe it's locusts that are like scorpions, but it's not just scorpion locusts. These locusts don't eat the grass, they don't eat plants, they eat people. But not all people, they only eat the people who are not sealed by God. So we've already talked about the sealing of the living God in chapter 7, where we saw that God placed his seal on their foreheads. This is God's way of saying, my people will be protected. You're a first century Christian. You've been persecuted. You have lost you've lost your life, or others that you know have lost their lives because of your faith. You've lost your livelihood because you cannot work, because no one wants to hire you, because you don't worship the emperor, and you're not in part of the trade guilds that go and worship at the temple. And you're reading this text, and you're reading about a plague of locusts. And that's something you know about, because it's something that's a real threat in the world that you live in. And you read that this plague of locusts is coming after not the grass, but the people. And you may think, another hardship that I'm going to have to endure. But God says, don't worry. It's not going to happen to those of you who have been sealed, those of you that worship me, those of you that aren't bowing down to the emperor, but instead are staying faithful to me. And so John is laying out these images, laying out these pictures. Power of scorpion, not to harm the grass or the trees, but only the people who have not been sealed. Verse 5, they were allowed to torment them for 5 months. 5 months is the length of a locust plague. Some have tried to, and I've read commentaries where some have tried to interpret the meaning behind this 5 months and given it figurative meaning. I think that's just getting lost in the details that John's not wanting us to get lost in. it was common knowledge that a locust plague, if a plague of locusts came, you needed to expect to deal with it for about 5 months, and then it would disappear. So for the reader of Revelation, you understand the locust plague. You understand the 5 months. And you also understand that 5 months is a relatively short time. We're not talking about a final and eternal judgment here. We're talking about a short judgment. But notice it says they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, this verse 6 I think is important. In those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. If you read this in the Greek has verbs and tenses that we don't have in English, and so sometimes it's hard to bring those over into the English. But this is a much more poetic verse in the Greek than it would be as we translate it into English. The picture is that the people that are being tormented by these locusts are constantly chasing after death. I think of the childhood game of tag. Anybody played tag whenever you were a kid or had grandkids or children? You know, the purpose is if you're it, you chase somebody, and your job is to tag them and say, "Oh, I tagged you. Now you're it." And so you're chasing after someone. That's the imagery that I get from this text. They're chasing after death. Life is so miserable because of these locusts that they're chasing after death, but they can't catch it. It's as if death is running just a little bit faster. The present tense describes a habitual present tense. And so it's not just right now. It is they are continually chasing after death, and death is continually fleeing from them. And so death is continually running away from them. So they're running because they want some finality to this torture, this torment. They're running after death because for them, death would be better than the torment of these locust scorpions that are going to become horses in just a minute. They're trying to run away from that. And they can't catch death. They can't get it. And so, again, for the first century reader, they're reading this and they're thinking, this torment that I've been dealing with of persecution, the loss of my life and my livelihood, and all that I have faced, it's going to come on those who have been doing the persecuting, those who have been costing me my life and my livelihood. They're going to face this. And as a matter of fact, they're going to face it to such a point that they're perhaps going to wish they had died. And they won't be able to do it. So martyrdom is death. What the people are doing to persecute Christians and killing them, they themselves will seek, but they won't even be able to catch death. That's kind of the imagery of how devastating this fifth trumpet is. And so then we jump into verse 7. Verses 7 and 11, or verses 7 through 11, give us a ninefold description of these locusts. We start off with verse 1. It says, "In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle." If you live in the Roman Empire, you know what it meant to see horses prepared for battle. You knew that there were enemies all around that had cavalries that could come in, and the Parthians particularly were a major threat to the Roman Empire. I'm not going to get into details about them, but you can read about the Parthians. The Roman Empire never was really able to conquer the Parthians, which were people east of the Roman Empire. And so there are some scholars that have said, well, he's describing the Parthian Empire here, the horses, the cavalry that they have. I'll give you my understanding in a minute. But it says, in appearance like locusts, in appearance the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. Then on their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. So you have the description of horses. You have them as crowns of gold. That's the second descriptor. Some commentators have said, well, this is blonde hair. I read one commentary, I believe it was Gordon Fee, who said that for him, he understood these locusts to be those peoples from Northern Europe that were a constant threat to the Roman Empire. The Northern Europeans, think of people like the Swedens and things like that, the blonde hair. He says that's the description of this army that was a constant threat to the Roman Empire. And so he kind of saw this description as kind of like that. They had long hair, so it's like women's hair. They had human faces. And it's clear that what John is describing is not pest, but is meant to be understood as some kind of army. The description with human faces and hair like women's, it makes sense that this could be some kind of barbarian army. But then you get into the fifth descriptor, lion's teeth. I mean, a lion's teeth are ready for devouring things. So you have this description of them having the teeth like a lion. And then they have breastplates like breastplates of iron. Breastplates of iron were a strong protection against them being defeated. You know, if you had breastplates of iron, you felt comfortable going into battle because you almost felt like you were invincible. You couldn't be hurt. The archers could not get you in the chest. And so you have these breastplates of iron. And then again, more imagery that makes this sound like we're talking about an actual army rather than locusts or scorpions or horses. It's the sound of chariots. You know, the wings of these locusts are the sounds of the chariots, the noise of chariots rushing into battle. This is not a sound that any of us are familiar with. But I can only imagine that the Roman Empire and those living within the Roman Empire probably recognize the sounds of chariots making their way through the cities as they make their way off to battle somewhere. And so this would be a sound that would, again, be one of those ominous sounds where you think, uh-oh, something bad is about to happen. You wonder what's going on. And you prepare for it. And so it's the sounds of chariots. And then the eighth descriptor talks about how they have tails and stings like scorpions. Of course, we've already seen this imagery mentioned. Now it's repeated again to kind of really bring home that they have the power of scorpions to hurt people. And again, the 5 months is mentioned. I believe, again, the 5 months, the only significance of the 5 months is just connected to the length of time that a locust plague would be, and also as a reminder that this is a short time of persecution. This is not what we might call the final judgment. And then the ninth descriptor is they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. Now, here's a question. Is the angel of the bottomless pit the same angel that's described as the star fallen from heaven to earth in verse 1? A lot of people say yes, and a lot of people say no. I'm of the opinion it really doesn't matter because John doesn't give us that description, and he's not trying to give us that detail. But that's a question that a lot of people try to figure out. So they have as their king an angel of the bottomless pit, and his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. And he gives them both, Hebrew and Greek. Remember, John is writing in Greek, but John if you read John's writing, it's almost as if it was written in Hebrew first and then translated. It's a very Hebraic writing, even though it's written in Greek. It's got a lot of Hebrew verbiage. It's got a lot of Hebrew writings, and so I don't know how to describe it any other way than to just say it's like someone who knows and reads and writes in Hebrew decides they're going to read and write in Greek. So he gives both the names. And of course, both of those words mean destruction. Now here's where I'm going to let you in on my thoughts on the text. And I reserve the right to be, I guess I'd say wrong. This is not a hill on which I'm going to die. But in my opinion, what John is describing here is the internal strife within the Roman Empire. And here's why. I think that what you're finding is John is describing internal destruction of the Roman Empire. One of the questions that we have is what led to the fall of the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire, particularly in the first century, was vast, and it was great. So how did a nation, an empire, not just a nation, but an empire like Rome fall? Well, there's a lot of speculation, but ultimately, three reasons have come to mind that a lot of scholars have fallen down on, and that is that, number one, natural disaster. There was a lot of natural disaster which really hurt the empire and in a lot of ways helped bankrupt the empire as they try to rebuild from natural disaster. Number two was internal corruption. There was a lot of corrupt leaders, particularly within the emperor and particularly within those that were in the aristocratic society in Rome. And so I think that what's being described here is internal strife within the Roman structure. And here's why I think so. The description of the abyss coming up from inside the earth is, I think, a description of the internal struggle that was going on within Rome. And I think that the purpose for which John writes, his name in Greek is Apollyon, is significant because the Greco-Roman Caesar was considered a god. He was considered the god Apollos. And Apollyon is a derivative of the word Apollos, which I think they're using as a play on words to describe the emperor, not as somebody who is a god, but rather as somebody who is a Satan-like figure, a figure of destruction. I think this because the star fallen from heaven from the earth. I think that what we have here is not a description of Satan himself, but a description of of a divine messenger bringing these calamities onto the earth. It's a picture to me of the internal destruction that was going on within this society. John is writing to people that have been persecuted because they refuse to say that Caesar is king. They refuse to say that Domitian, who is the emperor, is Apollos, the god. And instead, John is saying he's not a god. As a matter of fact, if you follow him, it's only going to lead to destruction. And all of the people that aren't sealed by God will ultimately be destroyed by their worship of this God. And so I think that's the direction that John is trying to go in this chapter. Now, again, I fully confess that there are a multitude of opinions as to what's happening here. But to me, this is the one that makes the most sense to me from a first century perspective. I've told you from the very beginning, the text cannot mean what it could not have meant. This was written not to us sitting in this room 2,100 years later, but this was written to Christians in the first century who were dealing with persecution, and so it had to mean something to them before it can mean something to us. Now, that's not to say it's not, through the transcendent power of the Holy Spirit, meaningful to us. It absolutely is. But it had to mean something to that first century first before it could mean something to us. John would not have written a letter to the first century and said, hey guys, read this, but you don't have to really worry about it. It's not until 2,000 years later that they're finally going to understand it. John would have written to a group that would have understood what was being said, and they would have grasped it, and they would have been encouraged by it. They would have understood that this means that they don't have to worry about not worshiping the Roman Empire, not worshiping Rome, because they worship a God that is much greater. And those who do worship Apollos, or the emperor, are not really worshiping a God. They're worshiping what will ultimately lead to their own destruction. Now, I think it's interesting that if you get caught in the the abyss or the bottomless pit of trying to research the fall of Rome, there are a lot of scholars who believe that Christianity is one of the reasons for the fall of Rome. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. Many of you know that Constantine became Roman Empire. He became a Christian, and he basically legalized Christianity in somewhere around the 300s. Once Constantine did that, basically Christian persecution ended for the most part. It took a little bit, but ultimately Christian persecution ended. But where does a Christian's loyalty lie? Where does our loyalty lie, ultimately? Is it okay to have national pride? Absolutely. Should we be proud of the country we live in? Absolutely. But our ultimate loyalty is not to the United States of America. Our ultimate loyalty is to King Jesus. The same is true in the Roman Empire. When you no longer worship the Roman emperor as a god, and your ultimate authority doesn't lie in the emperor, but rather lies in King Jesus, you are not going to put up with a lot of the same things that you would have put up with when you believe that that emperor is a god. And so I can understand how Christianity helped lead to the fall of the Roman Empire, because Christians didn't, when your king is a god and you've got to worship him, and that's part of your patriotic duty to worship him, then you're going to be a lot more loyal to that king when you think he's a god. But when you think he's just a man that's just got a job and has just been given a position, you may have respect for him, but you're not going to have the same dedication to the empire that you would if he's a god. And so the same is true here. I think that what John is describing here is, hey, there's internal turmoil, internal destruction. Now, what we're going to find in the 6th chapter is, I think, another reason for the fall of, or not the 6th chapter, but the 6th trumpet is another reason for the fall of the Roman Empire. And that is, you have natural calamity, that's chapter 8. You have internal destruction, that's described here with the locust, scorpion, horse, head people figures. Again, I'd like, if y'all want some homework, draw me a picture of what that looks like, and we'll all have nightmares together. But that's the 5th trumpet. But then you get to the 6th trumpet, and all of a sudden you have an army that's coming and attacking. And I think that is the external destruction, the enemies that are attacking from the outside in. And so what John is saying to these first century Christians is, you don't have to worry. Whatever you're facing, they will receive judgment. And Rome, they're not going to be around forever, because I am in control. I control the keys to the abyss. I control the judgment. I get to say when things happen. And you don't have to worry about what's going to happen to you. So any questions or comments, or I'll even take some different interpretations if you've got different interpretations.